My name is Michael Ben, and I'm the admin and founder of the Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Facebook groups. And it really is a project of trying to get psychoanalytic thinking and psychoanalytic ideas and content out into social media and have it sort of accessible to people who aren't just in universities or in training institutes, but to have it more broadly distributed. And part of that is because I think these ideas and discussions are so important and should be accessible to all. So it's been quite a successful project, and part of what we're wanting to do now and are doing is starting to do interviews and talks with analysts and with psychoanalytic thinkers like Sheldon George and Derek Cook, who are the editors of the book Lacan and Race, are the people we want to engage with and hear from and follow and learn from. So it's really nice having them here today. I'm not going to be hosting. The hosting is going to be from Andrew Poe and Enda Deburca. And the reason they're going to host is because they are well versed in Lacanian thinking, and they've really done a great job of spreading Lacanian ideas through the social media groups. So thank you to them, and I'm going to hand over to them. All right.
Hey, everyone. I just want to say thank you for everyone joining. So we're pretty excited to have Sheldon George and Derek Cook today. They were the co-editors of the new book, Lacan and Race, which is really a very incisive and powerful way to reflect and think on how race and racism works. One of the things that I think is particularly striking is how Lacanian psychoanalysis allows for a way to reflect and deploy analytics that take us into really only very recently beginning to be chartered territory, so to say. So it is, in a way, this book is a kind of threshold book that Sheldon and Derek have really brought together a number of different other essays and their introduction that we're going to discuss here, that really opens a whole new way of thinking on race and racism. I'm going to start really just to get the ball rolling with basically a generalized question that you can take as you really want to take it. And it's really about the motivation or the sequence of events that took you to begin on this project. And in a theoretical perspective, that's really one question. The other question also has to do with how, in this very sort of intense cyber environment of anti-racist discourse within psychology and new terms and various controversies around, say, CRT and social construction theory and privilege and white privilege, et cetera, which is a very often contentious site within the internet world. I really wanted to probe what it is about this particular way of working with Lacanian analysis that changes the way that we think and focus on race and racism. And maybe I think we just discussed this a little earlier that, Derek, I think you want to go from here to maybe elaborate on that and further thoughts.
Yeah, just to say thank you so much to everyone here for hosting us. It's a wonderful opportunity to reach out to colleagues and speak a little bit about the book and some of the work that Sheldon and I have done. There's a number of questions there about the cyber world, about theoretical perspectives, but let me just offer a few comments, and I'm sure Sheldon will join me in making those comments on why we've thought that a Lacanian perspective is so important today. And I'll preface those comments by referring to a PhD student of mine who asked the other day. He said, he made an observation, and he said, it seems to me that we're increasingly entering a kind of psychological turn in concepts of race and racism. Any name checked a whole series of theories, from notions of white fragility, microaggressions, unconscious bias. And I think he's quite right. I think increasingly there's a number of psychological theories which do a certain kind of work, and people are drawing on and utilizing to think about racism. Now, one reflection on that is we start to realize how many different theories and how many different everyday conceptualizations of racism are implicitly already drawing on psychoanalytic ideas. I mean, whether this is notions of projection, tolerance, fragility, they seem to already be building on a foundation established by some psychoanalytic ideas. Now, the Lacanian position is a little different because a Lacanian position would be quite critical of a kind of over-psychologization of psychoanalysis. Now, I want to broach this somewhat delicately because I don't want to get into turf wars about which psychoanalysis is the best psychoanalysis. But I think what we can say is that psychoanalytic theory is not, in a way, it's not just one body of theory, it's multiple different eras of theorization within Lacanian, the Lacanian world. And one of the things that it does is it both invites some critique and a different perspective on what might be the limits of an implicitly psychologizing type of discourse. Certainly inasmuch as concepts of projection or concepts of tolerance seem to rely, notions of white fragility as well actually, seem to rely somehow on prioritizing an ego of sorts or an egoic identity. Now, don't get me wrong, I think these theories are important and they've certainly got their place, but what a Lacanian perspective helps us think about is where there might be certain blind spots or problems with some of those theories. One of the first chapters in our book, in fact, the first chapter is by Todd McGowan, and he's got this line that Sheldon and I often cite. And it's a useful point of critique when we're thinking about notions of unconscious bias. And he says, it's a thoroughly Lacanian perspective, racism is not a knowledge problem. Racism is not an information problem. Racism is an enjoyment problem. And just within the space of that short line, we have a different perspective. So we can go into a lot more detail about that. But I think the short answer to the question is, Lacanian theory provides a wealth of concepts, whether we're talking about master signifiers, notions of lack, lamella, some of which are fairly Freudian, the big other, object A, desire, some of which are fairly Freudian, but some of which enable a very distinctive and different conceptual approach to issues that we've started to frame in largely psychological terms. The Lacanian theory is always going to try and take a step back from what it would imagine is too much of a focus on the intrapsychic, the egoic, the imaginary, the psychological, and give some different types of perspectives. So that, I think, is the abiding concern and focus, at least for me, in turning to these theories. And I think hopefully over the next hour or so, we'll be able to give you some examples of how a different Lacanian concept opens up questions of racial identity, racism in very distinctive and different ways. Sheldon, I don't know if you had some thoughts to add to that or.
So maybe I can say something about the first part of the question as a way of connecting back to Derek's comments. The first part about the genesis of this project. Derek and I were working separately on issues of race and psychoanalysis. And by 2014 or so, I was working on a special issue of psychoanalysis, culture, and society. And a strange thing happened. Every chapter that had to be sent out for external review, the editors of the journal kept on saying to me, send it to Derek Hook. And at this point, I had no idea who's Derek Hook. So I'm like, who the hell is Derek Hook? And why are you trying to send things to Derek Hook for me? But I think that was indicative of the sort of state of the theory at that point. There were only a few people you could rely on who were working in this area. So there was a lot of theory, and there still is a lot of theory that's engaging psychoanalytic concepts, but they aren't engaging it in a Lacanian way. So what's special about the Lacanian approach? I think part of what's special about it is the way that it brings together the social and the psychic. There's a way in which in Lacan, the other is always inside of you. The social is always inside of you. And you don't see that in most other theories. Part of what we're trying to do in this collection is speak to multiple audiences. And so I focus heavily on concepts of race that come from the study of critical race theory and the work of people like Henry Louis Gates Jr. and scholars of that ilk who really have no interest or no trust for psychoanalytic theory. But then on the other hand, what you have in Lacanian theory until very recently is an absence of a focus on race. So what the collection is trying to do is really bring Lacan to race and bring race to Lacan. And I think, it just so happens, just by chance, that today is the 40th anniversary of Lacan's death. One of the questions that Derek and I have asked of each other is, are you a Lacanian? And what does it mean to be a Lacanian? I'm not sure we quite have a clear answer for that, because what we're doing is we're deploying Lacanian theory, but we're also rethinking Lacanian theory. And especially for me, having this tie to this different audience that's more specifically focused on race, it means that in order for Lacanian theory to really work, it has to shift. It has to be remade. So there's great utility that we find in using Lacanian theory. There's an ethical component to Lacanian theory. It's focused on treatment. It's focused on results. And it has a historical legacy, a reformulation of concepts that span decades, going back to Freud, through Lacan. And part of what we find interesting in Lacan himself is the ways that Lacan continually remakes his theory. There's something generative in Lacanian theory. Lacan is always revising himself, rethinking himself. And so that proclivity in the theory itself is something that is unique and something that draws us to the theory. It opens up the theory itself to this process of remaking that we're involved in.
Maybe I can add also to what Sheldon is saying, because, reflecting on the question, it makes me think maybe we need to take a step back and say, well, what kind of theory or what kind of discourse is psychoanalysis? And the reason I asked that question, both in response to Sheldon's prompt of us thinking, what does it mean to be Lacanian, is to say that maybe we could find in Lacanian theory the assertion that a psychological discourse is perhaps not the only way, certainly maybe not the best way for Lacanian theory to think about racism. We see this in Fanon as well, where in Black Skin, White Masks, he does develop, I suppose you could say, more of a psychopolitical than simply a psychoanalytic or psychological theory of racism, although of course psychoanalysis is prominent there. But in later essays, he's quite strident about saying, racism is not only a psychological problem. In fact, I think his assertion is even blunter. It's just a psychological problem, basically. So what kind of discourse do we need today? Maybe it's helpful to have psychological discourse, but if Todd McGowan's right, then you could say about racism being more of a jouissance, an enjoyment problem than a knowledge problem or an understanding problem, then maybe we would have to admit that some psychological theories are perhaps taking us away from where the most crucial critical focus should lie. But again, then the question of what type of discourse do we need is an important one, because it means that we should maybe be willing to critique certain psychological forms of conceptualizing racism, even while we want to keep in mind that they might be crucial allies in certain perspectives and certain situations. But it seems to me so important also to bear in mind that something like Afropessimism is going to say, what's happening in the world of anti-Blackness? And if we're going to understand that, we have to have a turn to political ontology. So without opening up another whole topic of conversation, I think it's worth keeping that as a hanging question. What type of discourse, what type of practice can usefully inform what we're trying to do in thinking critically about racism and anti-racism? Maybe we can take something from a psychological discourse. Maybe we can take something from Afropessimism's attempt to think these issues at the level of political ontology. But it starts to make us think then, what kind of discourse is psychoanalysis? And throughout Lacan's work, he's unwilling to make psychoanalysis the subdiscipline of psychology, the subdiscipline of anything else. He wants it to be, have its own integrity as a kind of discourse of analysis. And I suspect in some ways, what Sheldon and I are also thinking is that that's an important question to keep in mind, even if we don't yet know what the answer is to it. And one of the reasons we know we don't yet know the answer to it is because we're still trying to say, there's still questions to ask of psychoanalysis itself. One of which is why, I mean, it's so difficult to conceptualize and answer, but why did Lacan take so long himself to think? And why is it that he hardly ever mentions racism in 30 years of his teaching? So we don't have to go there right now, but yeah, just wanted to share some thoughts and some introductory ideas.
So let me just interject here and just suggest that we move into discussing the introductory section in the book. And also I wanted to just highlight what you're driving at, maybe from people that are completely new to Lacan, or maybe have heard a bit about, is really, from what I certainly can see in the book and the orientation, is a focus on enjoyment, which I often find in American language is way too simplistic or misleading a term for what is really at stake here. When American translation of the term jouissance is not about enjoyment in the way people in American language often think of the term enjoyment. That is to say, we're not talking about going to, say, watch a baseball game. We could be, but we're talking about a little bit more intense type of thing when we are discussing the term jouissance and how that relates to drive and the real, and which are also somewhat difficult concepts for many people out there. But I'm going to just jump to the very more simple way of entering the term of the real, which is to talk about as well, something that account for. And I want to just urge you guys to keep these kinds of things in mind as you bring us forward in the introductory, section on the book and the concepts that you're bringing forward.
Yeah, I mean, I want to kind of pass over to Sheldon to get some more comments from him. But I suppose just to fill in some and respond to that, what I think is most valuable is that despite that, we could say that Lacan himself often doesn't, as I've just said, talk about racism nearly enough, which is kind of an incredible thing, given the context, the historical context of his teaching. Okay, I mean, there's the Algerian War of Independence, all of this stuff is going on. And there's a lot of historical information saying that he had a number of analyses colleagues who were from the colonial world, whatever. So this is clearly a question. But having said that, there's so many important and salient Lacanian concepts from drive, the real, the big other. And we'll speak a little bit about some of those. But I think drawing also on what Sheldon is saying, and also what I'm trying to say, these aren't psychological concepts. They're distinctively psychoanalytic concepts, they seem to do work in between. They're kind of, for me, to use a Zizek term, they're kind of indivisible mediators between the sociological and the psychological, if you could put it that way. Or they exist somehow between the psychical domain of the subject, of the individual, and the symbolic domain of signifiers, words, social meanings. And that in-between, indivisible betweenness of concepts like the signifier and the big other, I think is really, really important when we're trying to think about how to go about thinking about racism.
So in response to this question about the introduction and how we position ourselves in relation to Lacan himself, as Derek started saying, Lacan really does have an interest in relationship to race, but the book, though it's titled Lacan and Race, it really isn't so much about Lacan's personal relationship to race, though that is important. Lacan is, of course, as we say in the introduction, borrowing from the history of and the work of Sigmund Freud, who had a problematic conception of race. In Totem and Taboo, for example, Freud talks about savages and how they can become a means for understanding problems faced by neurotics who somehow have a sort of atavistic or regressive psyche that connects them back to these more savage states. And if you read Lacan himself, there are moments where Lacan seems to be resisting this kind of reading emanating from Freud's work. In Écrit, Lacan talks about the ways that Freud seems to be attached to a sort of a notion that develops really from the work of Darwin, a sort of evolutionary understanding of subjects. And Lacan calls it Darwinian buffoonery. That's a direct quote from Lacan. This is Darwinian buffoonery. But the interesting thing is that what Lacan is really resisting in Freud isn't the racism that says, certain cultures are more primitive than others. It's instead a developmental understanding of the human psyche. It's the sense that the psyche develops through various stages, whereas for Lacan, really it's lack that agitates all psychic development. So Lacan himself sort of starts this trend that I would argue is picked up by his students, where race seems unimportant. Derek mentions that Lacan had African patients. And in seminar, I believe it's seminar 17, Lacan talks about these patients, and he says that what he finds in them is absolutely no trace of their tribal heritage. And then he goes on to say that psychoanalysis cannot be used to do an ethnographic investigation. And he's saying this to a room of students who will become analysts in the future. And so fast forward a few seminars later, when we get to television, Lacan is being interviewed by Jacques-Alain Miller, and Lacan himself brings up the concept of race, and then Miller says, why do you prophesize the rise of racism, and why the hell do you have to talk about it? And so there is this way in which I think Lacan himself sets a tone that suggests that race isn't important to understanding the psyche. But yet still, I think there are concepts that are central to Lacanian theory that can be repurposed for the study of race.
Could I just intervene for a moment? Well, Sheldon, you did say something regarding what a really good aspect of Lacan, of psychoanalysis, is that it brings together, Lacan brings together the social and the psychic. Yeah?
Yes.
Which is fantastic, but nonetheless, it does seem he missed that opportunity. Yeah, regarding race. And I think, just I'll put this to you, That's because he had his own kind of theoretical resistance to collapsing the socio-symbolic structure with the other, yeah? So with the symbolic itself. So I'm just put that to you, Sheldon.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. You know, my own chapter starts off in the very first paragraph with a reference to a quote from Lacan, where Lacan talks about Freud, and Lacan says that Freud is like a good archaeologist. What he does is he digs the site, but then he leaves the site intact for others to come and explore it. And I think Lacan does the same thing. I think Lacan's theory goes beyond Lacan himself. And so the site is still in place for us to come back and repurpose it, rethink it, find race where Lacan himself had not.
Right. I think part of the resistance is because he definitely needs to keep the distinction between the fantasy as a construction of the subject and the social fantasy that's out there. Yeah? That there's two separate structures there. So I would think that he would be afraid that we would collapse those two structures, and that something in psychoanalysis, in Freud's unconscious, we would possibly lose.
I mean, it's an interesting interjection there, and thank you for sharing it, because at some level, I mean, one of the tensions that is given us in psychoanalysis as a discipline is how to, at the same time, clinically be attentive to the singularity of the speaking subject on the couch. And one way of dramatizing that point is to say that you could say there's a great many different ways of being individually racist. Yeah. So one, you know, presumably is attentive to the almost infinite texture of an individual life through which certain ideas, racist ideation, for example, might come to the fore. So if that's true, it becomes quite difficult for psychoanalysis to try to be a kind of sociological theory of race and racism in one respect. Okay, so I hear your comments. I think it's really important. And maybe I think at some point this is even a comment that Michel Foucault makes, that psychoanalysis is a discipline which is always going to have this potential rift between the level of theorization on the one hand and the absolute singularity of a given person. Yeah. So just to honor that point that you're making, I suppose that we could say that maybe the role of Lacanian social theory is to think about such concepts as racism as the theft of enjoyment. And there, maybe psychoanalysis is starting to take some risks, because psychoanalysis is not sociological theory, although I think it can usefully inform sociological theory. And you know, Sheldon was just referring to the relationship to anthropology as well. And I think, if I remember correctly, the section that he's referring to, Lacan says something like psychoanalysis is not anthropology, but then he also sneakily adds, well, you can't really do anthropology without knowing something about psychoanalysis. So then one further comment on that. I think that within the remit of Lacanian social theory, which is what Sheldon and I are constantly referring to, the precise kind of work is to see what concepts we can get and how might those concepts fit a precise domain of application. And I think Sheldon's work does this really well, often with reference to literary texts. There's some very precise and careful, historically located work that has to be done. And you know, I think in many respects, each of the chapters tries to do that. But I'm also going to raise a little flag and say, even if Lacanian social theory may sometimes make a problematic move, and I'm thinking here about racism as the theft of enjoyment, which is a theory which I think is unbelievably rich and unbelievably helpful in opening up certain facets of racism. The idea for me is that it cannot be a total explanation. Obviously not, because it needs to be located almost as a kind of hypothetical suggestion, a question that then could be taken to a given social historical location and say, does this theory illuminate something of what is happening here? What does it help us focus on? Does it focus on modes of surplus jouissance? Does it draw our analytical attentions to, say, for example, the self-righteousness of the individual who perceives the other to be problematic? Mm-hmm. So just to say, I do hear that question, but I also think that even when psychoanalysis is utilized at the level of what I'm calling Lacanian social theory, in other words, supplying us with certain concepts that we then need to do the detailed, careful work of applying, I think it is useful, but of course, forever, the point is not that psychoanalysis is not a Weltanschauung, okay? I mean, you always got to, and I think any clinician would say this is obviously the case. When you're confronted with what I'm calling the infinite singularity of the analysand, or presumably the infinite singularity of a given social historical position, one listens psychoanalytically, but one shouldn't necessarily absolutely impose the theoretical framework over everything to such a point that one is no longer able to hear or see or do something disruptive. And I think Sheldon is also referring to that when he says, in some respects, Lacan is iconoclastic in his relationship to Freud, even while he's a devotee of Freud. And indeed, he's iconoclastic in his relationship to earlier Lacan. Which means, again, that one is constantly trying to listen to what might be a limitation and how the I suppose, empirical material that emerges from the clinic or from the socio-historical context that one is investigating might have a pushback effect on the theory as well.
Brilliant. Where are we going next, Andrew?
I believe that from here we were going to talk about a little bit. I think we've discussed a bit in the introduction section, but we could go a little further if you guys could tell us a little bit more about some of the different essays that are in here. I don't know if we have enough time to go through all of the different essays briefly, but I think there's a lot of very interesting work going on that if you could just give us a little bit of a portrait of that, that would be terrific.
I can give a quick overview. So you guys have scheduled this as a set of three sessions or 4 sessions with our contributors. So people will get a chance to hear from them. But the book in general is broken into 4 sections, and the first section is titled Read in Racism Through Lacan. And in this section, what we're trying to do is we're trying to apply Lacanian concepts, Freudian concepts, and so those get applied first through Todd McGowan, who talks about knowledge and enjoyment in relation to fantasy and the notion of race as fantasy. And then Derek picks up the concept of the theft of enjoyment. Hilary Neroni, who will be on the show a couple of weeks from now, talks about confederate signifiers in Vermont and the removal of statues and confederate symbols and their relationship to a fetishistic approach toward jouissance. And then there's a piece by E. Chibrolu, who focuses on Lacan's Rome discourse and uses it to talk about white nationalism and the manifestos that the white nationalists write. And then Wayne Wapimukwa talks about indigenous peoples and their relationship to Freudian Oedipal conceptions of identity and the ways in which colonialism sort of repeats an Oedipal structure that is problematic both within colonialism and also within Freudian theory. So this is one of the moments where the book is directly taking psychoanalysis to task. And then, so that's the first section. The second section, the first section is the longer of the 4. The second section is focused on racial identification and efforts to think about how we can move past concepts of race. And here we have essays by Jennifer Friedlander, Derek Hook, and Molly Ann Rothenberg. And the third section is on race and the clinic. And here we have a piece focused on Afropessimism and how Afropessimism can encourage us to rethink race within the clinic itself. And that piece is written by Corinne Malone and Tiara Jackson. There's also a piece here by Patricia Garavici that focuses on Latinx patients. There's a piece by Kazushige Shingu, which focuses on Japanese patients. And then Sheila Kavanaugh will also be on the show. Her piece focuses on the movie The Portrait of Jason, which is sort of presented as an interview with the first gay African-American man to appear solo on screen. And she talks about him in relation to the Lacanian concept of perversion. And then finally, the final section is focused on an effort to theorize a Lacanian subject of race. What does this subject look like? And here we have discussions of the drive, sexuation, Lacan's concept of the lamella, Fanon's concept of the zone of non-being. And the essays in this section are by me, Gautam Basu Thakur, and Michelle Stevens, who will also be on the show. And then finally, we end with an afterword from Kalpana Seshadri Crooks. One of the things that we wanted to do in putting together this collection was pay homage to some of the work that had been done on race and psychoanalysis in the past. And when Derek and I were grad students, we were reading people like Christopher Lane, who had written The Psychoanalysis of Race, and we were reading Kalpana Seshadri Crooks, who had written Desire and Whiteness. And that was the moment when psychoanalysis and race, sort of melded in really interesting ways. But then after that period, less had been written that combines psychoanalysis and race. So part of what we're trying to do with the book is revitalize that focus.
Yeah, there's a lot in the introduction. We could go much further into some of the different things that you guys touched on. For example, race is a fantasy, objet and illusory object that fuels racial desire while also agitating the drive in its pursuit of jouissance. I mean, these are really crucial concepts that I think we can really unpack here. We have a little bit of a time constraint, though, so I want to urge that we maybe from here, I guess, just switch over, if that's okay with you guys, to the way we schedule it, that Derek would now talk about his particular essay, which a lot of these issues emerge, and we can get more into in some of the particular terms at play, like what is meant by objet what do we mean by jouissance, et cetera. In particularly in this context of talking about race and racism as well.
Great. Well, thanks. Maybe I will speak about one of the chapters in the book. Thanks to Sheldon for that overview. And one way of linking that useful introduction and what I'll speak about is that it's kind of fun in retrospect to look back at the book and see what are the types of conceptual conjunctions that some of the chapters do. And we've certainly realized that through the process of the book, I'm thinking of Gautam Basu Thakur's chapter in particular, but also Wayne Rapamukwa's chapter is, the idea of linking post-colonial critique to psychoanalysis is something that the book does. But interestingly as well, there's a whole series of other conjunctions which maybe in previous eras of psychoanalysis were less overt. I mean, one, again, maybe that's not a new one, but is thinking Fanon alongside Lacanian psychoanalysis. It's got something of a history, but again, it seems to be entering a new stage. And also the question of how to think Afropessimism alongside Lacanian psychoanalysis. So again, just pointing to kind of a holding space at some point, if we had the time, we could return to that. What are the interesting conjunctions of psychoanalysis and other theoretical formations which enable us to do some interesting pieces of critical work? Making that comment then enables me to introduce one of the chapters that I wrote. And that was very much an attempt to engage at some length a really remarkable and somewhat undervalued paper written by the novelist, the South African novelist, J.M. Coetzee. So, a lot of people know Coetzee, Nobel winning author for some of his novels, quite rightly so. Many people know him for some of his literary writings, his literary critique as well, rightly so. But a really important essay he writes in 1991 is called The Mind of Apartheid. And in that paper, which, to my mind, I think if that was the only thing he did, that would be pretty remarkable. He does a lot of things. Unbeknownst to him, or maybe he does know, but he's working on this project, The Mind of Apartheid, towards the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. And one of the questions that motivates this paper is how to understand the madness of apartheid, how to understand, you could say, the madness, the obsessionality of white supremacism. And he tackles the question in a very sophisticated way. And he tackles the question by employing, to great effect, a Freudian frame of analysis. And because he's a literary scholar, and again, we have these questions of what kind of discourse, psychological discourse, we should utilize in thinking about racism, he uses a literary mode of engagement. And because he wants to use a literary mode of engagement, that's his training, that's his expertise, he turns to the writings of a key apartheid ideologue, a man by the name of Cronje, Jeffrey Cronje. And he starts reading through all of these tracts, these sociological texts that Jeffrey Cronje produces, basically as a validation and justification of white supremacist ideology. And in so doing, Coetzee starts to do something which is quite psychoanalytic. He uses and traces the language very carefully to see where there's moments when the language folds in on itself and starts to give forth implications that the author doesn't quite intend. Nevertheless, the reason I mention this here is that at the same time that Coetzee is writing this paper, which is like a really long, extensive piece of research, which clearly involved a concerted project of reading. This is the same time when the Slovene school and Slavoj Žižek and various others are really trying to utilize Lacanian theory as a mode of ideology critique. So, The Sublime Object of Ideology comes out in 1989, and Coetzee is working on some of these challenges in his paper. And his paper is very much about how do we think apartheid, the madness of apartheid, in response to ideological formations and also predominant theories of ideology at the time. So what I try to do in that paper is to say, well, how can we overlap these approaches? Coetzee comes up with a question there. He says, how do we understand the madness of apartheid? It's a question that's still relevant today. We could say in terms of maybe slightly differently, what is the madness of white supremacism, or what's the madness of, and I'm a little bit cautious of the words I'm using here, just because recently I've got into a little bit of hot water on Twitter for making certain critiques. But essentially you could say, what is the pathology, or what is the structure, or what are the psychical dynamics that underlie something like an obsessional form of whiteness? And for those of you who don't know the paper, I'd really recommend it, because his application of a Freudian register, focusing on notions of displacement, focusing on notions of ambivalence, of compulsion, it's really an excellent piece of Freudian analysis. But without getting bogged down in those details, right towards the end of the paper, he's still trying to get an answer to this question. And there's really two questions you could say. One is, what drives this economy of white racism? Why would white people do something like this? Why does apartheid continue, even in some respects, when it would be contrary to the economic interests of a white electorate? So he wants to know about that. And the tentative answer he comes up with is one of the things that seems to have driven this ideological machine and the psychology of a kind of obsessional whiteness was the phantasmatic figment, the prospect of a kind of, he puts it in these terms, a fantasy reward or phantasmatic reward of whiteness itself. Intriguingly, he's not able to fully develop that answer. He gets there. And in other words, one of the things that's important about this is he's suggesting that racism is not merely structural. Okay, it's not merely a factor of the momentum of economic discursive structure of privilege and dominance. It is that too, but there's something else that is required. There's something else about a libidinal investment, about a fantasy, about some kind of reward, or some kind of, in Lacanian terms, a fantasy object that I need to obtain and hold for myself. So that's one.
Eric, I just want to interrupt just for a moment. So how, because I think for many people, or at least I certainly see a lot of people discuss it in this way, that it's often thought of that racism and even the structure of apartheid, or in the United States, the persistence of various complicated structures of racism up through the civil rights era, that it's often thought of as some more or less a kind of structure of scapegoating, that there's a kind of like, and what I really get very strongly from a lot of the writing here and from the Lacanian analytic is that what you're pursuing is a sort of a deeper persistence, that the way in which the structure of race and racism persists beyond simply looking for like a figure to blame. That's a part of it, but there's something else going on, what you're talking about with the recuperating of a perceived loss of castration, etc. I just wanted to emphasize that to be something to draw out further for the audience so that they can understand the distinction.
That's helpful, because one of the, I'd mentioned that there were kind of two questions, and one of the questions that Coetzee is interested in is that at a certain period of ideology theory, the notion of structuralist theories of ideology would, I mean, you know, we have to be careful, but don't really place much emphasis on the role of an individual, and then certainly don't place a lot of emphasis on the role of an individual psyche. So Coetzee asks a whole series of questions then. Well, if ideology and racist ideology is this virus-like spread of ideas that has this kind of momentum that continues to grow, and there's something interesting in that theory, how do we understand the role of singular subjects in the perpetuation of racist ideology? So the paper is a kind of mediation on these things. And I suppose, yes, that question of what Lacanian theory offers us here comes in a kind of oblique way in Coetzee's argument, because it seems that something like fantasy and an engagement of what one presumes the socioeconomic frame, the big other of this society means, and what it gives for me and what gives me value becomes very important. Put more simply, I think part of what Coetzee is saying is that we need to engage with the mechanisms of fantasy as well in the understanding of ideology. And there's certainly periods in a structuralist theory of ideology where that vocabulary of individual desires, of fantasies, is just not part of the picture. Incidentally, and I'll try and simplify as I go on, incidentally, one of the other questions that Coetzee raises in a very provocative but very useful way, in a way that's echoed and preempted by Fanon actually, is to say, and I think we need to keep these questions in mind, that racism itself can be seen as a form of desire. Okay, those two terms don't often fit well in our everyday thinking. How can racism be a form of desire? But it's certainly the case for moments in Fanon, and certainly the case for Coetzee. And when we start to apply the thinking of desire and racism together, one starts to get a sense of the fecund, ongoing perpetuation of racism, which is, as desire in a sense starts to feel like it has no end. So that's the complicated part. Let me then just quickly say a little bit about how this all applies to Lacanian theory and why Lacanian theory is useful. And I'll try and make things a lot more straightforward. There's multiple concepts that Sheldon and I have alluded to that find their way into the book and that are useful, and I think do a kind of critical work that other theories don't allow. And part of the fact that happens, I think, is something to do with the fact that psychoanalysis is born in the clinic, right? So the concept of jouissance, this highly paradoxical notion that there may be some gratification in the extreme, in the painful. This is a concept, I think, that we see exemplified time and time again in the clinic, and I think it becomes very illuminating and useful and brought into the domain of social theory. So here we go. This is essentially the point I'm trying to make. One concept that I think we find in Lacan that we don't find elsewhere. Maybe we see some intimations or shadows of it in some other places, but I don't think we find it deployed and thought in quite the same way, is the notion of the big other. The big other, just to give a little bit of background for people who are less familiar with these ideas, the big other is a kind of notion which suggests that in human societies and individual human subjectivity, there's often some kind of point of appeal, a point of reference, a locus of the truth beyond my own subjectivity. What that also means is that if I'm embroiled with an argument with Sheldon about whatever, we can point to some, whatever it is, Lacanian expert, some Lacanian text, and try and find an answer. Okay, so the idea here is that the notion of the big other, it can't be reduced to simply a singular subjectivity. In fact, the big other as point of appeal or locus of truth or treasury of signifier, all of these are terms that Lacan gives us to try and understand this concept, is what grounds and underpins the very possibility of intersubjective interaction. Now, let's build on that a little bit. What that means, and Sheldon has already pointed us in this direction, is that you can never have in Lacanian theory idea of a merely intrapsychic type of subjectivity, or intrapsychic dynamics are never merely a depth psychology or an internalized psychology. Why? Because the very words, the concepts that I use to formulate and express myself always come from the treasury of the signifier, the big other. And of course, we know Lacan often brings Hegel into play to say that the desire of the subject is always the desire of the other. So if we take that seriously, that means that there's no such thing as an isolated or insulated intrasubjective subject. Rather, the subject is always stretched between reference to something like this big other, this point of appeal, this treasury of the signifier, and we can also say this reference point or treasury of ideological values. Now, this is helpful to us when we think about racism, because if the subject is always involved in the question, the phantasmatic question that doesn't necessarily need to be actually literally spoken. What does the other want? What must I be? Who should I be in this place? What does the other want of me? What's special about me? How can I engender the love of the other? This is a kind of matrix of fantasy. If that is the ongoing question, then we start to see that what Lacan and Lacanian theory does, I think, is a kind of partial breakdown of this separation that we get in so many theories of individual and society, of subject and the symbolic order, for that matter, the psychological and the sociological. The big other is the kind of indivisible mediator that hangs in between these things. And then we can say, just to build on that, and then I'll relate it back to racism, there can be no subject, there can be no individual subject without the big other, because the big other is the language, the big other is the reference point of desires that makes that subject viable. And similarly, we can also say that there is no big other without the subject, because the big other is the subject supposed to know, the reference point of authority. The big other is the transferential subject supposed to know that the individual subject believes in, and thus, in a sense, engenders. Now, apologies for all that theory, but perhaps you can see where this is going. Why this is important is you could say that merely psychological theories of racism are not in and of themselves enough, right? And we can do important work within the remit of what we could call psychological or ego-based theories of racism. Even in Fanon, of course, we see a reference to the use of the mirror stage, and we see that those type of dynamics of racism. But we can say that maybe a psychological theory, an ego-centered theory of ego dynamics, projection, projective identification, to use some of the Lacanian terminology, is not all we need. We need something more than that. You could say, okay, good. We also need a sociological or a social-political or discursive theory of racism. And yes, we can see moments in Lacan where we have that as well. In other words, you could say, what is the big other, if not that kind of socio-historical set of values, that kind of structural impetus of racism? So we can use bits of Lacan to try and inform both of those levels, a psychological, ego-focused dimension of racism, as well as a more sociological, historical level of racism. But the importance of the notion of the big other is that it's the thing that's indivisibly between those. And what that then means is that in Lacanian theory, racism should be seen as existing at those levels, but maybe part of what makes it so persistent, so effervescent in some respects, is that it is also caught in between, in a kind of dialogue between those levels. So just to bring it down and concretize it as much as possible, if we're saying that the elementary matrix of fantasy in Lacanian theory is, what do you want from me? And again, it's not necessarily a conscious question. Sometimes it is, but it's an enacted, lived proposition more than it is a kind of word proposition. That means then that racism can be constantly recycled, reiterated at the level of the subject's engagement with what they are hoping to find as an answer to what the big other means for me. And if it exists at that level, Lacan is both giving us the resources to think psychological levels of racism, sociological, historical levels of racism, but also the fact that racism exists as precisely a kind of ongoing dialogue between these two things, whereby the subject is trying to find out what they are, what their desire is with reference to this big other. So to conclude then, I know that was a lot. What I think is useful then is when we read Coetzee's essay, one question we could ask is the big other racist? And certainly in the apartheid context, we would have to say, yes, the big other is racist. And we can apply that question to multiple geographical and historical contexts. Maybe the answers will be slightly different. But the further impact of that, and this is where the psychoanalytic angle is important, it's not good enough just to say that the social structure itself is racist. That's hugely important. But how is meaning engendered, fantasies engendered, and certain types of rewards engendered for the maintenance of certain types of identities? And I think that's what Coetzee has a basic intuition of when he says that the white electorate in this crucial final period of apartheid was still hanging on to this idea of some phantasmatic rewards that are enraptured in and wrapped up in whiteness itself, in the Afrikaner folk. This idea is important, and it goes back, I think, also to Andrew's question. Racism is not merely structural, it is that too, but it must also be viewed in terms of the transferential relationship and phantasmatic investments that individual subjects have to those structures. And it's in that process of being recycled, reiterated, rethought, and phantasmatically deployed as an answer. Whiteness is my special fantasy object, for example. And that special fantasy object is given a name for Lacan. I sometimes jokingly refer to it as a kind of libidinal treasure, but it's the thing that's more me than me. And it holds out the salvation that all those moments of lack, of inability, of impossibility, Lacanian moments of the real, that don't quite make sense. But as long as I can hold on to this phantasmatic element, and in Coetzee's paper, and I think still today in many respects, part of that answer, and we should be more textured and careful and historically precise when we venture an answer to that question, but it certainly seems within the domain of white racism, there is some phantasmatic object, some object A, that is very, very precious to a given white community, and they will do almost anything to hold on to that. And I'll say one final sentence. One of the most interesting research topics linked to some of what we've done here for me is to ask questions about white anxiety. I paid a pretty heavy price for doing that, but it's an important question. And I actually do not mean any disrespect to any white colleagues, or actually I don't mean an attack on whiteness. It's often how I'm read. But what I'm saying is it's tremendously frightening to be in a situation where your phantasmatic object is threatened with being taken away with some kind of castration. And one thing I have learned about this experience of even suggesting such things is people act extremely aggressively and very defensively if you are to suggest such a thing. And I'm not going to attack anyone for those kinds of comments, but I think it is a case in point of just exactly how precious those phantasmatic rewards and investments can be in a racial identity. I'll stop there because I know that some of these concepts are also really quite brilliantly explained in some of Sheldon's work. So let me stop there, and maybe Sheldon wants to take on from where I've left off.
So I'll just say something, hopefully fairly short, about my work and my chapter in the collection. It's a chapter that focuses on sexuation. And I think it brings us back to some of the issues that Derek is discussing. So the chapter begins with a focus on this question that, as Derek mentions, is central to subjectivity. Now, this is the question that Lacan says the subject has to ask of the other in order to become a subject. That question is, what am I there? And Lacan presents the question as one that the subject answers for themselves in two ways. Now, there are a couple of components to this question. On the first part, on the first hand, that last part of the question, the there, what am I there, is really about the subject asking, how can I position myself in the symbolic world, in the world of language, in the social world, right? So what am I there? But it's a question that Lacan says is fundamentally addressed to the other. And for Lacan, there's more than one form of the other. At its core, the other is the unconscious. It is what's removed from us. It is what is other to us. But Lacanian theory brings, conjoins the unconscious with the social. And so this question is in actuality a question that is addressed to a physical other, an embodied other, such as the mother, right? And Lacan tends to sometimes capitalize the O in the word mother to indicate that the mother is the other. So this is a question that's addressed to the other. So we have this social dimension where it is the other who's telling us who we are. Now, I've said that the answer tend to emerge in two ways. According to Lacan, the answer comes in the form of some sort of response at the level of being, right? The subject is probing a sense of being. It's the kind of question that Hamlet asks, to be or not to be. What is the nature of my being? Who am I? Right? This is the question the subject is asking. But Lacan says that there's also a component by which this question is focused on sex. And this is something that Lacan and Freud find in the hysteric. What am I? Am I a woman or a man? Should I desire from the position of a woman or a man? So sexuality and being for Lacan become the ways that the individual answers the question of their subjectivity. Who am I? What should I be? But clearly race is a component of that. And so my assertion is that we must look at race if we are to understand subjectivity from a Lacanian perspective, which of course is something that Lacan himself did not do. So subjectivity could be connected to a notion of lack and also to a notion of object A in the ways that Derek has already directed us toward. For the Lacanians,
can I just interject for one moment?
Yeah, sure.
Because Sheldon, I thought one of the things that's really rich in your essay is the way you explore, I don't know how to explain it, like a kind of a particular dialectic, how specifically historically, for example, how Irish poor working class worked with minstrel genre as a way of sort of differentiating themselves. So from within this hierarchy of capitalism, this early form is how I read what you're saying. And then, and in a way, it agitated and created a sort of new state space or imaginary of racist tropes, and how that specifically worked, though, in this relation of an anxiety of who am I, and then how it was stealing from the perception of an enjoyment of the other, of the Black body's enjoyment, and then lampooned and sort of took off. Anyway, I just wanted to add into that, because what's interesting about it, one of the very particularly interesting things is the way the dynamic works in this rather complex way. It's not like separated, you just have white people over here and Black people over here that are not actually engaged in a kind of, I don't know how to put this, is double dialectic, because they're misreading each other in a way, we could say.
Right. There is part of what I'm trying to suggest is that there is this dialectical relationship that constitutes subjectivity, right? Subjectivity is constituted through an interaction with the other. And in many cases, it's the racial other. So for Lacan, desire is rooted in lack. I would suggest that what race does is it promises to fill lack. So the subject desires because the subject lacks. What race does is it tells the subject what to desire, what can fill me. And Lacan has a notion of subjectivity and of the subject that is tied both to desire and to the drive. And I think both of those are components in how I think about minstrelsy. So what happens at the level of desire is that, we desire the thing that we lack. For me, this process of desiring the thing that we lack gets transformed in the social sphere through race, because race becomes the thing that we think we lack. That is the thing that will fill us. And so what I'm doing in the piece is I'm working from Freud, who in group psychology talks about what it is that binds together groups. He talks about the leader having this treasure, in Derek's word, this sort of intangible, rare quality that the group identifies with. And that rare quality seems to be the possession of all members of the group, but yet still it's somehow absent from them. It's like this excluded center of their identity. It's the thing that unifies them. And I argue that abstract thing in contemporary group associations is often race. It's race as object A, race as Lacan's fantasy object. It's the thing that is inside all members of the race so that they're all similar, but also the thing that somehow is absent from them, so they need other members of the race to unify with to become whole. But subjectivity doesn't only function at the level of desire, it also functions at the level of the drive, specifically in relation to the object A. Lacan talks about the drive again as connected to lack. But whereas desire for Lacan is connected to lack that's instituted through the signifier, right? The signifier sort of strikes out your identity. Institutes lack in you. It sort of misnames you, if you will. Whereas desire is connected to the signifier, you can say that the drive is a sort of bodily concept in Lacanian theory. The drive is the thing that you lose through the process of embodiment, right? It's a sort of libidinal energy that is cast aside. Lacan talks about the constitution of the body through metaphors of the placenta and the egg splitting apart, and like there's a part of it that's cast aside, a throwaway part. That's the drive. It's the part that's sort of excluded from the subject, but yet still drives the subject. And the drive, Lacan says, has no object. It's this energy that sort of circles an object, but it doesn't aim directly for that object. What I argue is that race as object A starts to agitate the drive, right? If we think about the lasting resilience of racism, part of the reason that racism is so insistent is because it circles the object A of race cross-temporally. And what it aims at is something that is ahistorical. So it will never get that ahistorical thing, even though it's aimed at this temporal thing. So it's always missing its mark, and it becomes what Lacan calls the narrative that has to always be written, right? The narrative that has to always be not written. in the process of trying to write it, because it can't be written. So you're trying to use race to sort of get to some sort of engagement with the thing that is lacking, and you always miss it. So you end up circling it over and over and over again. And the way that this plays out in minstrelsy is that, Lacan talks about this concept that he calls invidia, which he describes it as a substitute jouissance. He also describes it as a sort of jealousy. And this is connected to Zizek and Miller's discussion of the theft of enjoyment, which Derek also writes on. But the sense is that invidia is this envy that we have of the racial other or any other who seems to have the object A. So the object A is a fantasy object. No one can have it. But what happens is we fantasize that the other has it. And there's a moment in one of the seminars where Lacan talks, well, he talks about this in multiple seminars. He talks about St. Augustine. St. Augustine looks at two children, and one child is sucking at the breast of the mother, and the second child looks on in envy. And Lacan says that's invidia. That is, the child isn't so much envious of nourishment, the nourishment that's coming from the breast. The child is envious of the fact that the other child has the breast, has the object A. And my assertion is that what you had in slavery was precisely that dynamic described by Lacan through the reference to St. Augustine, where in actuality, you had Black mothers who were forced to breastfeed white children. And so this fantasy structure of invidia becomes socialized. So the social is, the psychic is experienced externally at a social level. And then what happens is the sort of abstract notion of an other who has stolen my jouissance, who has introduced lack into my being, becomes historicized. It becomes possible to identify a specific individual who has done this or a racial group who has done this. And so coming out of slavery, you have a sort of rivalry for the object that can fill the subject. And you have this sense that it is the other who has taken this object from me. So that's
because I was thinking in reading where you get into this in your essay in further detail, I was thinking a friend of mine, an older Black man, he explained to me how in South Carolina, up through the early 60s, there were all of these rules of social order. So as a Black young man, a boy, he, for example, like when you were walking down just an ordinary street on the sidewalk and you saw white people coming this way at a distance, there was just an understood thing. You had to get off the sidewalk. You had to make space. These are just ordinary things. And it occurred to me, we were talking about how really recent that was on one level, that this all changed rather only 30 years ago. But it was all very normative part of everything. And that's what I was starting to think about, that it's not only that there's this violence that we think about, this sort of violence of racial structures and racism that is implicated. It's also, I'm wondering if you could think about or comment on this ordinary controlling of the structures, this everydayism of, and where does what's happening? I mean, we can only speculate, of course, on one level, but when those white man and woman are walking this way and they see Black children, they see them jump properly off the place that they're supposed to do. What's really happening there? It's like a control. It seems to me, I would just theorize that on a very minimal level, it's like a reassertion that the relationship to the fantasy object is sustained. So
yes, I think that's correct, because what I would argue is that whiteness is, of course, a fantasy, and what you have in relation to the object A is really the constitution of subjectivity and identity. It is the object A that allows you to define your identity. So the sort of movement of the drive that Lacan describes is a circular movement where the energy of the drive shoots out of the subject, circles the external object, and then re-enters into the subject. So there's something about the external world that facilitates the constitution of whiteness. So their identity in trekking through the road, through the streets, is dependent upon certain social structures. Their very subjectivity is dependent upon it. And we see this perhaps more starkly in times of slavery, where you had slave masters who would become white based upon their ability to hold slaves. Holding slaves was proof not only that you are a member of a superior class, but also that you are somehow more human, better than other whites, not just better than blacks, right? Better than other whites. Holding slaves, having slaves, allowed you a certain social status. And so there, you literally have the figure of the object A. You have the fantasy object as slave, as your possession.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And quite literally also. And so then there's that kind of hierarchy of who really has, you have this funny hierarchy then is created of the lower, higher whites in that spectrum.
Right.
Who really, anyway,
so you rise in class by having more slaves.
But you don't actually have the object A, yeah?
Of course not. Of course not. But what you have is a symbolic that reinforces your imaginary fantasies. That's really what you have. That's what whiteness is all about. That's the power of whiteness. It's the ability to project your imaginary into the social and have it reaffirmed.
I think this is one way we could see this in terms of how fantasy itself is structured. Because it's structured, but along with its structure for this complete jouissance, it also stages castration. Yeah. So that's already inbuilt into it, that it's going to self-destruct. Mm-hmm. And what you do with that self-destruction, again, you find an object to externalize. Yeah.
Right. Whiteness has its own built-in contradictions because it assumes a supreme humanness that can never be achieved.
Absolutely.
There was something else I wanted to bring up with you because you raised it. You deployed the concept of the real in a very interesting way that I think might be difficult for some audience who are not really familiar with Lacanian thinking, but it's really, I feel, very important to what you're driving at, which is you were driving at that you're really arguing that it's an agency outside of language, to really think of it not so much as just the impossible, but sometimes you see it argued that way, but to think of it really as an agency of language, which is quite a little bit Hegelian, actually, way of thinking about how it operates, because we usually in Lacanian texts, at least my familiarity, it's not quite brought to that level of thinking of the real as agency, because that means it has an action of operation. We can, in retrospect, assign that, but in phenomenological experience, when we're talking about the real, it's often described as more of as I said, an impossible that we can't account for, that we kind of make a projected. I'm sorry.
I think if you think, I'm not a clinician, but if you think more clinically, jouissance is tied to the insistence of certain forms of pleasure. And that's what racism is about too. It's, to get back to what Derek was saying about, telling me what to desire. Racism is a mode of jouissance. It's a mode of enjoyment that we learn and we become habituated to. And so it's for this reason that I think of racism in relation to the drive, which does have this insistent energy, this insistence on coming back. Lacan says the real is the impossible, but it's also the thing that always keeps on coming back. The real is what comes back to the same place. And so it does have that force of movement. And indeed, what I argue in the chapter is that racism is an unconscious form of enjoyment. It comes from a structuring of the psyche around modes of enjoyment that are socially determined and then get repeated by the subject. And so from that perspective, you can think of racism as what Lacan calls an interdit, or a sort of slip of the tongue. It's the unconscious speaking. We gain unconscious pleasure from
It's very
racism.
interesting. It's also, for many people listening, they might not quite grasp that when Lacanians, I'm maybe be a little bit rough here, when Lacanians are talking about the unconscious, we're not idealizing the unconscious. The unconscious is a mechanism or a system that is not like some romantic, beautiful thing that we just, has all the wonderful answers if we only just find a way to tap into it. It's rather a different situation filled with a lot of nonsense. So it's not exactly romanticized in any way, shape, or form. I wanted to now, I think we should move to taking questions from people at 2:00. But I have still myself some other things that I would love to hear a little bit more. You mentioned in your essay as well. Well, there's quite a lot to go on, but you mentioned the Lacan's in Seminar on Ethics. He talks about the crucifixion in particularly and how that works. I thought it was very interesting the way that you explored that, the ate concept.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit for us, because it's very interesting how that relates to what you're talking about. Because it's a little different than the object. It's a kind of sort of fixed image thing, almost, the way I understood it.
Yeah, so the object A is the fantasy object that we're trying to pursue. The ate is something that Lacan says has raised to the level of the thing. So the thing is like, the final object that can make me whole, right? So the object A is like a fantasy object. It's more intangible, but the thing is like the thing. It's like, that's it. There's nothing else, right? That's the thing that I want. And the way that Lacan talks about this is through a religious context. He suggests that we could think of God as sort of positioned as the thing. And then Jesus Christ and the image of the crucifixion stands as both a barrier and a lure toward the thing. So Jesus Christ is the ate, right? And the term ate comes from the Greek word atrocious. So the crucifixion is this atrocity that both draws us toward God and protects us from collapsing with the beyond. And my argument is that in some ways, race functions as ate. Race promises us access to the beyond. And the racialized figure simultaneously could be seen as the thing that's preventing me from achieving complete satisfaction. Why am I not happy? It's because the Mexicans are taking my job, right? So the racial other is both the barrier and the attraction that tells us there is this beyond, there is this ultimate satisfaction this incomparable bliss that I can achieve. So there's a way in which race functions to fuel the fundamental fantasy of the subject, the fantasy that lack can be filled. And one of the things that I do in the chapter is talk about how lynching also gets tied into that, and how the lynch victim sort of stands as ate. But I also make the final argument that in a way, race is the ate for psychoanalysis. That is, race is the barrier that psychoanalysis itself has not gone past. Because what you do in the clinic is you actually try to go to the thing, at least temporarily. Whereas in the social sphere, it's not necessarily something you want to do. It's something that fuels racism. But in a clinical context, clearly race is something that we want to theorize and understand. So we want to go beyond the ate to the level of the thing. The thing, of course, is synonymous with Lacan's concept of the real.
Right. Now, we have a whole bunch of questions here. I'm wondering whether we could start in on that, if that's okay.
Unless Derek wanted to say something right now. Is there anything you had on your mind that you wanted to put in right now, Derek?
Fascinating discussion. I just wanted to add one comment, and then I see some fantastic questions coming in, which some are quite difficult, but hopefully we can try and respond to. Just in terms of Andrew's idea about the real not often being linked to agency, I'm always reminded there's a section towards the beginning of seminar 11 when Lacan says something like failure is cause. And that idea of failure as cause, I mean, if you think about, apparently Lacanian theory, there is no such thing as a sexual relationship. But we know, don't we, that there's an awful lot of attempts to make that work. And just in terms of something else I've been writing and thinking about in terms of embodiment within racist contexts, you can see that the very dilemma, the impossibility of ever fully inhabiting a body and ends up in racist situations of the delegation of bodiliness more to Black subjects and white subjects. So just to reiterate the point, when there is a real, there's a whole lot of activity, there's a whole lot of impetus for something to happen. So there is an agency paradoxically within something like the real. I wondered if we could, Sheldon, if we could maybe spend some time, sorry if we can turn to the questions, I hope it's okay. Yeah. A former colleague and friend of mine who I see has just posted a question, Hamadi, who I used to work with in Johannesburg. So I'm delighted that he's here.
Let's go for it.
Can I?
Yeah, let's go for it.
He says, using Lacan to theorize race seems to privilege the position of the white subject. How does one deploy Lacanian theory in theorizing Blackness and its position, particularly in the relational matrices characterizing racist spaces? So Hamadi, that's like the most difficult question I've ever had in my life. So thanks for that. But actually, I think Sheldon and I can maybe between us try to muster something of a response. And I think it would have to be a kind of two-step response. One would be to say that there's a brand new book by David Marriott, who is trying to think the role of Lacanian psychoanalysis alongside Afropessimism. And his move is to say, right at the beginning of the book, what hasn't adequately been theorized is the very whiteness of Lacanian theory. What do we do with that? And what is this, about the apparent, and you see this in Afropessimism a lot. How can Lacan not have said more about these things? Mm-hmm. So that's, I suppose, the first question. But we see within David Marriott's work, also actually within Gautam's chapter in our book, one attempt to answer something of that question is to say, maybe it is the case that how we think a certain form of Blackness is being located in terms of what the Lacanians would refer to as the real. And maybe if we could try and make that more basic. Interestingly, there's a paper by the late Peter Hudson, who was also at BITS Hamadi, just while we're doing the BITS Johannesburg thing. And he kind of picked up on this idea as well, which is to say something like this. Within the colonial sphere, Blackness seems to be accorded an impossible position. On the one hand, you could say Blackness does appear alongside whiteness in the symbolic realm, because Fanon tells us there's always this Manichean, however you pronounce this, blackness, whiteness, division, segregation, apartheid, it's all about that, right? But on the other hand, blackness is posed, or what is apparently posed to blackness is a kind of impossible position. What should I be? And remember how Fanon opens black skin, white masks. What does the black man want? And his response is to be white, but of course that answer is never going to work, right, in a racist society. And of course there's all this material in Fanon also, which is very important to Afropessimism, the idea that the black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white. There's a lot of theory that stems from that and lots of different debates. But to cut a long story short, what Gautam argues here, what David Marriott develops as well, is that we might benefit from thinking the Lacanian concept of the real as one way of highlighting the conundrums, the impossibility of inhabiting blackness within a fundamentally racist regime. There's a lot of intricacies to that argument, which I'm not sure I can do justice to right now. And this in South African terminology is a hospital pass. A hospital, I don't know if any more other American people know what that means, but when you pass over to Sheldon when you haven't answered the question properly and it was an impossibly difficult question, I think I'm going to do that now, although I suspect I'm not getting any more Christmas cards from Sheldon after this.
That's perfectly fine, Derek. Actually, I think there are probably two things I can say. There's a lot of work. I'm just trying to look at the book real quickly. There's a lot of work that's happening in the book at the level of theorizing Black subjectivity. So, for example, Sheila Kavanaugh will speak to the group and she'll talk about perversion in relation to the figure of Jason in the film, The Portrait of Jason. But also, Karine Malone has a piece on Afropessimism that is very much interested in thinking about what Derek was talking about, which is the relationship between Blackness and the real. And she talks about the real, well, Karine and Tiara, it's a co-written piece. They talk about the real in alignment with Christina Sharp's piece on wake work. And Sharp talks about wake as a metaphor, the term wake as a metaphor for the experiences of African Americans. And it's a polysemic term because on the one hand, she's talking about what happens in the wake of the history of slavery, the leftovers of the history of slavery. And she talks about this wake as a sort of wave also, as an element of the environment. So in that context, they're thinking about the real as environment. They're thinking of anti-Blackness as an environmental reality for African Americans, as a sort of exclusion that centers the symbolic, right? And slavery itself as an exclusion that centers the symbolic. So there's this alignment with the real and the experiences of anti-Blackness. And Sharp also talks about wake work in terms of having a wake after someone has been killed, right? So that opens up to a discussion of things like police shootings, which is something that they take up in the piece. But also wake work is about communal gathering. It's about sitting at a wake and mourning. And so they are also thinking in terms of what sort of mourning needs to be done and how can this history be addressed most specifically within the clinic. So that's one connection that comes to mind. And I will say just briefly that my own theorizing in the chapter on sexuation talks also about how the drive constitutes the body as a racialized body, how the circularity of the drives goes out to the external world, encounters the object A, which is the fantasy object, and then takes on the fantasy of race and inserts it within the body. And so the body becomes resignified, remade, and even the drives become, they start to agitate in a different way that sort of privileges race.
Right. Just following on from that, can I just ask a question which sounds really stupid? Yeah? So the question would be, is it possible to have race without racism?
Derek, do you
understand what I mean by that?
Yeah. So I have an opinion on that. Derek, do you want to?
I suppose the standard response is no, that it's, racism is what makes race. So that'd be my, just off the top of my head response.
Exactly, racism is what makes race, yeah? Rather than race makes racism.
You know what I would say? I would say that racism in its multiple forms and multiple types is what gives something like race a kind of substantiality, a phantasmatic substantiality, a symbolic reality. Maybe it's presumably one can comprehend or conceive of certain tokens of types of difference that aren't weighted in quite such a potent and kind of freighted way as race has become. Yeah. So maybe as an intellectual exercise, we could think about certain forms of race existing without racism. But I think that in terms of race existing in the way it seems to exist for us, where it is entangled with various very potent signifiers and phantasmatic and libidinal investments, then I think racism is partly what engenders, more than partly, is what does engender race.
Oh, wait, I want to just encourage that Sheldon speak here on this, because in your essay, I think you really unveil a very interesting, again, historical contingent development having to do within Black history politics and Du Bois and everything. There was a certain move at a certain point of where it was stressed from what you've written of, and I've seen this also spoken of in other places, a shift, an idea of we need to not just think of ourselves identified in sort of Baduian way, the truth, function being around religious sensibility, Christian sensibility. We need to think of ourselves as unified by race in a very different way. And that was as you described, and I'm speaking for you now, that it was really within a political deployment. Yes. And what's interesting there is that's an ethical move that is very conscious of the political situation, and it has to do with how we're going to deal with it and how we have to apply this thinking now and change the community to think this way. Now, the other part that you get into, which I really want to get to, is that you talk about how it nonetheless persists, or the question of it persisting when there's no longer that political need. The question of so that's
So historically, if we look at African American history, religion was really what unified African American sensibilities, African American sense of self. The concept of race was a concept that was imposed by the slave master. It was not something that slaves would, necessarily be anxious to embrace, especially in the early days of slavery, when slaves were still being transported to locations like the United States. And, many of them were coming from warring groups and were very much aware of internal differences that divide them beyond any notion of skin color. But, in a certain historical moment, people like Du Bois, especially Du Bois, started arguing that there was a political necessity to embrace race and to resignify race, give it a positive spin. That sort of suggests to me that to get back to what Derek was saying, I would say that race is a way of seeing that's necessitated psychically. So what that means is the difference, there are inherent differences. Race is a category of difference, but there are multiple categories of difference. And there's nothing specifically about race that makes it the thing that should determine how we classify groups, right? Why not classify them by hair color, or why not classify them by height or whatever, right? I think from a psychoanalytic perspective, there is a need to see difference. That is, seeing difference serves the purpose of retaining for us the fantasy that we can fill lack. It enables us to think that we only lack because of some other, because of the actions of some other. So there's a sort of psychic propulsion toward this act of seeing difference. But that doesn't mean that we only have to see difference in terms of race. It's just that race has become sort of knee-jerk. There's a social history that has encouraged it.
Yeah, I think it's Molly Ann Rothenberg who speaks a little bit about that in relationship to difference, the difficulty with the category of difference. But she kind of moves on away from the ego ideal, which we already talked about, will create this pathology of the group. Yeah? But there is a difference which is different than a positive attribute. Yeah. Yes. So that difference is the unary trait.
Yes.
And I think this is very interesting, but just in terms of a possibility of having a group that didn't identify on the basis of a positive attribute, which they could give an attribution to.
Yeah.
It seems, yeah.
There's this group called LAC, which tries to, it's a conference that tries to identify precisely at the level of LAC. And I think they're trying to implement precisely what Molly is talking about. Molly is making the argument that we tend to identify with some sort of positive category, or we think that we identify with some sort of positive category. But she is making use of Lacan's concept of the ate, and she's thinking of the ate as an image that is drained of all meaning, of all sort of sentimental attachment. Because what is supposed to happen when you encounter the ate as a barrier in Lacan's work through the figure of Antigone? Lacan discusses how Antigone goes past the limit. She goes too far. And what she does in going too far is she establishes the limit, and she tells us, don't go past here. So she drains us of our desire to get to the thing in the beyond. And so the question is, how can we find something that will drain us of those desires? For me, I've talked about the work of Toni Morrison, her novel Beloved, as one of the ways that art shows us how to mark the barrier that we should not go past.
And doesn't it, very late Lacan, I think it might be 24, I think he says something about the signifier that is drained of its jouissance. Yeah?
Yes, exactly.
Anyway,
we have a few more
questions. We should. Sorry, Andrew. What?
I just so we have a couple. We have it's 2:15 here in New York City. I think we have we can probably handle maybe 2 more questions. Is that okay?
Some questions.
Have you had a chance to look at them? It's really up to you which ones you'd like to answer. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, there's one I picked out here is, again, this says it's a broad and maybe naive question that is looking for a more practical answer. I wonder how Lacanian analysis could become more attractive, desirable to subjects from racially diverse backgrounds. in the clinical context, in your opinion? What can be done apart from books and conversations like this? Which is something, of course, but what actually needs to change? And was this from Michael, actually?
No, that's from...
It's from Jazz.
Yeah.
Okay, that's from Jazz. So to Derek and Sheldon, I don't know if you precisely caught all of that. But really it's asking what needs to change to make Lacanian analysis become more attractive, desirable to subjects from racially diverse backgrounds?
I mean, I'll give you 5 seconds of a response, and
yeah.
Maybe Sheldon would also comment on that. I mean, 2 thoughts. One is that Patricia Geravici is, really, I think, certainly within, I don't know, much of the United States, is perhaps the person who's done the most to think about this. So she's got an edited book. Her chapter in the book as well talks about this. Psychoanalysis in the Barrio, about how one might be able to do clinical work in a kind of non-elitist way at a kind of street level downtown clinic. So she's very committed to that, and her work is quite an inspiration. So I would suggest that maybe that's one resource that people could look to. The other, though, is just to say, although this risks still sounding within the enclave of intellectual language, I mean, I think both Sheldon and I are committed to trying to find ways of expressing some of these ideas that avoid some of the opaqueness and the density. I mean, we don't always succeed, admittedly, but I think it's an ongoing project. And my view is, and maybe I borrow a bit from Bruce Fink here, but my view is if the ideas are to be clinically operative and helpful at some level, then although Lacan makes them very difficult to access, there are some practical, important ethical ideas from the theory. And if we can try to utilize those and explore them and put them in an operationalizable way, that itself, in effect, is a kind of political work.
Okay.
I completely agree. Just to reiterate what Derek said, I think one of our goals in doing this text was to make it accessible. And we picked contributors who wrote clearly, who didn't try to emulate Lacan and who didn't go for obscurism. And we feel that, discussions of race have to be practical, they have to be historicized. There are numerous chapters in the book that talk about race within a historical context. And so I think part of it is just taking away some of the abstraction and thinking about psychoanalysis in really practical applications of the theory. But I will say, too, that what is so exciting about Lacanian concepts is their complexity. And race itself is a complex object, a complex object of analysis. So you need a theory that's robust, like Lacanian theory, to really grapple with it.
Okay, thank you, Jazz, for that question. We have one from Michael Graffals. Hope I'm pronouncing that properly, Michael. Thank you for the enriching conversation, guys. I was wondering, how would a Lacanian approach consider the effect of racist interpolation on those being positioned in this way? I'm reminded here of the analysis of moments of racial interpolation in Fanon. Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, when he describes the moment as being responsible not only for my body, but also for my race and my ancestors. I cast an objective gaze over myself, discovered my Blackness, my ethnic features. So the question is, I was wondering, how would a Lacanian approach consider the effects of racist interpolation? So I'm thinking about interpolation in terms of Althusser as well, but do you want to take that, Derek? Or
I do have something to say. I don't know, Sheldon, did you want to start? Or
let me say something real quickly. So my first book actually addresses directly that moment in Fanon. And I won't get into it too much, but there's also a chapter in this book where Trebrolu talks about the white racist shooter, and how he is interpolated. This is a reading that comes from the Rome Discourse, through a reference to a sort of reference of who I will be in the future once I have committed this act, this murderous act of killing the other. So there's a way in which the interpolation, according to the argument of this chapter, happens retroactively. So that's one way of thinking about it. There.
Yeah, funnily enough, I was also going to refer to Sheldon's book, because what I tried to do actually was collect a series of examples of Lacanian engagements with this moment that Michael is questioning. And one of the things that I think a Lacanian approach does is gives us a little bit more definition about the temporality. And of course, Sheldon has anticipated that response. And I'm happy to forward some of that to you if you were to contact me. But so basically, yeah, I think it's often said in Lacanian circles that Lacan does something with temporality, which is quite innovative. And there's multiple different ways, nachtrachtlichkeit, various different kinds of ideas, the future anterior, all of this. But I think one Lacanian contribution to that is to think about interpolation and think about the temporality of racist interpolation in various ways. Sheldon's book does it as well. Then the other thought would be to try and also keep it maybe a little bit more manageable for the moment for a short answer, is could we not say that moment in Fanon can be read many different ways? And of course, Fanon is a kind of hybrid theorist, and there's Sartre there's the gaze, there's all sorts of things happening. But one of the things that seems to me so powerfully presented in that moment is also the corps morcelé, the body in pieces, and the colonial body in pieces. So there's multiple shattering impacts that are experienced in that moment. But one way, and many critical phenomenology scholars have said interesting things about it as well. But one thing that seems to be so evident is that there is something about the Lacanian idea of the body in pieces, which is brutally reenacted in that moment of objectivization of the subject, whereby something of one's bodily experience, one's physicality, one's subjective sense is assaulted and no longer holds together in the same kind of cohesion, which should be the case in a more hospitable environment. And that poses interesting questions also about maybe the limits of phenomenology in engaging that particular piece. But it's an interesting way to think about it.
I just need to interject because we have a little bit of a time crunch here. And I know that I understand that you guys have a time limit as well. So I think we do need to close up in about 5 minutes. Or if you have time to extend another 10 minutes, because we have a few more questions. So I just want to check in with you. It's totally fine. Of course, if everyone we have to end, we have to end.
But I think we've covered a lot. I just say really from the whole group here, from the PPP, thank you, Sheldon and Derek, so much. It was brilliant to have you here. It's so exciting to hear your talks. And the book itself is fantastic. We began at the very beginning talking about we seem to be at a moment where of transformation somehow in the social order, particularly in relationship to race. And in fact, I want to talk about that moment just very briefly. That it's something that the group itself, the psychoanalytical group here, PPP. Now, I was interested in 3 books. Yeah, I was speaking to Mike Ben about this. One book was Lacan and Race, obviously, and fantastic. We have some more talks coming from writers there. Second book was The Autistic Subject by Leon Brenner. And again, this is to do with something of a transformation in a social order, which is producing a change in subjectivity. Yeah? Again, there is a kind of a common thread through this in relationship to the ego ideal and the retreat somehow of the symbolic other, but also the binary signifier, a certain failing in that. Yeah. So again, Leon Brenner links that to the lack of to the foreclosure of the unary trait, yeah, rather than a signifier. And again, that foreclosure of the unary trait, allows for a different subjectivity to emerge in relationship to language. So the last book we talked about was this one, Transgender. Again, these are about changes and the binary signifier not holding in the ways that it used to. So we will continue these talks on Lacan and Race. And after that, we do hope to have a talk on this. If we could invite the author, Patricia Gorvici, that would be fantastic if she could, but that is our next step after Lacan and Race. Mike, do you want to say something just to finish it off? Well, thank you again, guys. It's brilliant, yeah?
Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you very much. I mean, what an incredibly stimulating talk. I feel so enriched, and it's been brilliant. Thank you very much. I know, Sheldon, you've got to go quite promptly, but it's been wonderful, stimulating, and I really encourage people to read the book, share the book, encourage people to buy the book, spread the word, yeah, I think that's really what I would like to say. Just thank you very much. It's been a privilege. And Andrew, have you got anything to say?
No,
and also
perhaps
Sheldon and then?
Perhaps we can set up a way that maybe we can get to some of these questions in another format, through writing another way, because there's a few more questions that are interesting. But in any case, I just want to say really fantastic discussion. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Sheldon and Derek, a lot. And that's all I really have to say at this point.
Thanks for having us and for hosting the series.
Brilliant. Thank you as well.
Thanks. It's lovely to be here.
And thank you, Yvonne, yes, for the background admin, and Michelle.
Okay, everybody. Thanks again. We'll talk to you later. Ciao.
Cheers.